Deep in the heart of what was the Łódź ghetto in Poland, there lies a simple image of a small Jewish boy. Part of a project called Murals of Memory, it is the most evocative piece of street art that I know. For the child is a child of his time, and his time was the period of German occupation and of the Holocaust. When you look at him, he seems to look back at you. His eyes, beseeching, pleading awareness, begging contact, are full of sorrow and pity, but also maybe numb with the recognition of his situation. The Łódź ghetto, the Germans called it Litzmannstadt after a revered general from the First World War, was the second largest in German occupied territory after Warsaw. To walk its streets today is like entering some historical twilight zone, a place that has resisted the test of time in both its mystical and concrete context. The buildings of the Holocaust period are still there, shells without their inhabitants, ghostly echoes of a bygone era which was once industrious and thriving, that housed some 223,000 Jewish people until the Nazis came. Amidst all the sites of former Jewish life and traces of the Holocaust, amidst the buildings, plaques, memorials, signs, street names, ancient pathways and modern renovations, this isolated image shines out as a testament to what probably became of him, but also to the certainty that thousands did die here and close by, victims of a belief that what was constituted as a religion and as a people would never fit into such a narrowly constructed version and vision of us. That they, as Jews, were somehow both different and dangerous. That, consumed in the warped and fanatical racial supremacy that was the essence of the Nazi state and its continuation into occupation, they had to go. And that meant not just them as people, but their beliefs and traditions too. That little boy symbolised much, and that made him radiate that bit more. The intent of National Socialism in Germany was always clear if you chose to look and pay heed. Point 4 of their 25-point programme, announced by Hitler to a packed audience in Munich's Hofbrauhaus on the 24th of February 1920, some 13 years before Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany, stated the following: "Only a member of the race can be a citizen. A member of the race can only be one who is of German blood, without consideration of creed. Consequently, no Jew can be a member of the race." No other community was specifically mentioned, no other potential outsider group, just the Jews. Once in power, a succession of discriminatory regulations and practices, an escalation of exclusionary measures within the German sphere of influence, in particular but not confined to the Nuremberg laws of 1935, pushed Jewish people not just to the fringes of society, but to abandonment, to forced migration, and ultimately to something much, much worse. In genocidal terms, this meant the destruction of all signs and vestiges of Jewish life, not simply the eradication of communities and the killing of individuals. Marginalisation, vilification, persecution, oppression, murder of the innocent in the name of the perceived right and superiority of the citizen. To recognise and ratify the dominance deemed natural of those considered born and genetically predisposed to rule. And ultimately to inflict on those from without, those that didn't belong, the Armageddon of genocide. The Nazis, of course, were no strangers to the use of fire, most pointedly in their torchlit processions, most completely and savagely in the burning of thousands upon thousands of bodies in camps throughout occupied Europe. They burned buildings, on Kristallnacht in 1938, and on many other occasions. They also burned books. One of the most macabre and disturbing events of the entire Nazi period was the sight of books being thrown onto a bonfire of hate in the centre of Berlin in May 1933, a sight that was replicated many times over. Books that were considered un-German, not just because of who had written them, but also because of their content and purpose. One of the authors banned under the regime was Heinrich Heine, who, perhaps prophetically, had said over 100 years earlier, "Where they burn books, they will also ultimately burn people." Whoever the boy on the wall was, in reality or imagination, to me he was a light in a starlit sky of goodness and virtue, a panorama of beauty and humanity that characterised those that sought to defy the forces of evil and who shone in defiant opposition to the darkness of the Hitler regime. He joins a list of many, some honoured, recognised in life and in death, others less so, or in some cases hardly at all. That this category of the righteous includes many, many Germans that were citizens and members of the race should not be a surprise. They showed solidarity with their Jewish compatriots and with the plight of Jewish people, and indeed many others subject to persecution and more. They showed kindness and compassion. They recognised what was happening, supposedly in their name, and they acted in measures, large and small, against it. This included members of the armed forces and indeed, in some cases, members of the Nazi Party. What they demonstrated perhaps needs unpicking. What does light essentially represent? Illumination, of course, but also warmth and purity. A flame attracts attention. Its hypnotic majesty and intensity is hard to replicate. It serves as an example of being, perhaps, of one of only a few essential elements in what makes the world function. It signifies universality. It compels togetherness. It is no coincidence that the candle features dominantly in many religious traditions. It is often the first thing we do to kindle and begin the act of collective prayer. It perennially shines through religious festivals and holy days. It represents life in its actuality and at its end. Its symbolic power is perhaps without equal. Throughout the course of history, we see time and time again representations of the candle and its flame, in murals, in paintings, in books, in religious practice, and in everyday life. We need to heed the lessons of that history and of the history of hatred. The history of good intent, of noble virtue, and that of evil manipulation, deception and purpose. We can't ignore the latter simply because it goes against the rule, or because it is seemingly an exception that proves it. The threat, the growing threat of Hitler was largely ignored, in Germany and elsewhere. He was seen by many as disturbing, but not necessarily as dangerous. He could be controlled. He may himself be moulded into something that could be useful. In other words, he could be used. He would go away in time, a minor blot in an age of uncertainty. A blemish on the face of a weary nation still harbouring resentment at the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. A small inconvenience perhaps, but not dangerous. We must never repeat this example of mass misjudgment and almost universal complacency. Call it what you like, a lack of foresight, lethargy, metaphorical sleepwalking, outplaced conviction, over-caution. None of these terms must enter our conscience when faced with the menace of division, discrimination, animosity and hatred. And that begins with every single one of us. Because we all have the capacity and the power to intervene and to make a stand, just as we are able to comfort, shed warmth and show compassion. We can all be a beacon of light and hope for those around us, and in this age of globalised connections, to make our mark, however simple, however brief, in small measure or large, nationally, internationally and globally. We just need the inclination, the willingness and occasionally the bravery to act as such. Of course, the genesis of the genocidal dictator that was Adolf Hitler lay not just in the reality of indifference, moral anemia and contested political and social division of interwar Germany, but in the chaos of recession that characterised the economic markets of the time, in Germany, Europe and across the world. Recent periods of recession in Western societies, whilst undeniably challenging for those at the harshest extremes of its impact, perhaps do not match, in societal terms, the colossal repercussions of the Great Depression that began with the Wall Street crash of 1929. And yet, despite our greater comfort, stability, the security of state support, and for many economic prosperity, relatively speaking of course, radical and violent movements led by charismatic yet dangerous individuals have, again and still, managed to sow the seeds from which hatred at its most extreme can grow, in stature as well as numbers. Hitler they may not be, but even the most modest and peripheral examinations of their character and their intent should give us cause for anxiety and concern. We cannot be complacent. We cannot afford to turn our heads away and simply wish upon a star. We should and must follow the light of our convictions, our path of active opposition to indifference and hate, illuminated by the surety that comes from a living flame, one that will burn in intensity and unswerving purpose as long as we need it to. We owe it to the victims of the Holocaust and genocides before and after. We need to make their legacy an active and compelling one. The COVID situation perhaps affords us an opportunity to take stock not only of our own individual existence, but our collective attempts to make society not just bearable, but effective. So many people have played their part in tackling the pandemic. We all know people like this. They don't necessarily even have to wear a uniform. Heroism, industry, kindness, and sheer dogged determination are not confined to those in specific areas of employment or in official positions. They are represented in the general public too, essentially by every one of us. COVID gives us an opportunity to address the health of us all, not just our physical and mental states, but our moral fortitude, our desire to help each other, our mutual focus on support and community togetherness, our need to ensure that people, anywhere and everywhere, who are without not just the basic constituents of living, but of the means and support to help recovery, our common notions of health, strength and prosperity as members of the human race. This all begins perhaps with a single flame, a sign of warmth, comfort and hope, a light to shine and a light to lead, a light that we must ensure is never extinguished. We need to use the light for the right reason, to sustain and enrich us, not to kindle any fire of hatred towards others, not to destroy the products of human progress, not to inflict pain and dismemberment, or to highlight the abomination of purposeful discrimination and genocidal intent. There are spectres in our borough and in our country of institutionalised inequality, of cavernous gulfs not just between those who have and those who haven't, but between those who are allowed to belong and those perpetually perceived as hard to reach, but who in reality are easy to ignore. The danger of acceptable hatred is evident wherever and whenever we choose to examine its early and its mature manifestations, its historical antecedents and its new characteristics, its predictable followers and those being led into new situations of hateful indifference. The modern masters of hatred do not necessarily follow the paths of what came before. They are as likely to emanate from positions of advantage and relative security as from their antithesis. Their message of accusation and blame is, however, as consistent and as obvious as it's always been, and as such we must use the advantage of history to oppose, to repel, and to extinguish the flames that nurture hate and lead us paradoxically into new ages of darkness. Bigotry, injustice and unfairness remain living features and elements within our national and global society. The Holocaust should have been the ultimate apocalypse of hatred. This recognition lies behind the never again reflections and assertions that were uttered in its wake. They were protestations too, calls for surveillance and vigilance, a focus for attention, a lesson in history. We still utter those words even after acknowledging that since 1945 the world has witnessed numerous acts of genocidal inhumanity, acts that continue into the present. Searching for common values amidst the celebration of diversity is essential. Looking for examples of human feeling and togetherness everywhere. Supporting those in our human race that want to reach out and support people in need is crucial. Learning from difference in cultural context and habit, whilst recognising our shared humanity, our common causes and concerns, our unity in striving to find remedies for local as well as global problems, is an absolute must. Our unique ability to choose common cause and intent over selfish ambition and discriminatory action must illuminate everything we think and contemplate. This will lead us to action, to do what is right and just by us all, to light an everlasting flame of righteousness, of justice, and of common purpose.